Let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome you to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's creator, host, and chief cat herder. And I'm delighted to see you all here today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We've got a lot to talk about and a fantastic guest. And before we proceed with the guest, let me introduce the forum and explain a bit about how it works and where it came from. So you should know the forum is a discussion-based venue. And what I'm doing right now with this slide will only take a couple of seconds. Our point here is to have conversation between people, mostly through video as well as through text and images. The idea for this sprang out of our long-running project, the Future Trends in Technology and Education Report. And that's a monthly trends analysis that's been going on for almost a decade. It looks at about almost 90 trends that impact education and technology. If you haven't seen it, go to ftte.us and you can download a couple of sample issues or subscribe if you like. Now, the FTTE report and this Future Trends Forum are part of a broader project called the Future of Education Observatory. Now, this is a multimedia, multimodal, ongoing, and participatory attempt to grapple with the future of education and technology. It includes the FTTE report. It includes this forum conversation. It includes a blog. It includes a book club, as well as a bookstore, and a podcast coming up really soon. If you haven't seen that, just go to futureofeducation.us and you can learn more. Now, we can only do this work with the help of some very generous people and organizations who support us, and I'd like to thank them before we proceed. First of all, I'd like to thank NYSERNet from New York State. That's a nonprofit that helps that state's colleges and universities get online and do great work together. They do great research, great professional development, and it's just a real pleasure to be supported by them. We're also grateful to Shindig because, as you can tell, Shindig makes available the technology we're using right now. So if you're new to it, or if you haven't been in this environment for a little while, let me just walk you through it so you can see how it works. First of all, where I am and where the slide is, just for a moment, is called the stage. And it's called the stage because everybody can see and hear everything that goes on up here. Now, there are two little pods right now, one for myself and one for the slide. I'll get rid of the slide in just a minute. But beyond me, you can have up to 3 other people. So imagine, for example, myself and our guests in just a couple of minutes, as well as 2 of you as a kind of pop-up DIY panel. And in fact, as you'll see, if you're new to this, that people come up here and ask questions by video all the time. It's a really neat environment. Now, below us, you can see a whole bunch of different icons, either represented by a video feed or by a silhouette or a photograph. Each one of those represents one sign-in. Typically one person, sometimes 2 or more around a table. And if you mouse over them, you can learn a little bit more about each one. Now, if you'd like to have a private conversation with somebody else in the audience, simply mouse over them and click on them. And if they want to talk to you and your technologies are working, then your 2 icons will snap together like Lego bricks. And you can have your own private audio-visual bubble, which is pretty neat. But I said the forum is all about conversation, and there are 3 different ways, actually, where you can have conversation with the entire group. And let me just touch on these. All 3 of them can be found at the very bottom of the screen. Running along it, you'll see a white strip. And on the left edge of that, you'll see 3 buttons, and that's the key. The leftmost button is a number with a tiny silhouettes underneath it. It has number 23 or 24 now. And that's a list of everybody who's on this. If you click that, 2 different windows will pop up. The one on the left will give you a film strip overview of everybody who's climbed in this conference with you. And on the right will be a chat box. That's a typical basic chat box where you can type and read conversations with other people. In fact, it's usually about the 19 or 20 people who have logged in with you. So you can have that kind of conversation. We find people like to share links. They like to try out ideas. They like to share thoughts as they develop. And it's a nice way for people to informally converse. Now, back to that white strip, you'll see 2 more powerful tools. One of them is a question mark with a circle around it. If you press that, you can type in a text comment or a question that I will receive. And when the time is right, I can flash that on the screen for everybody to see, and I can read it out loud for everybody here. And that's a really useful way to talk if you don't have video capability. Now, if you do have video capability, go back to that white strip. The next button is a raised hand with a circle around it. If you click that, that tells me you'd like to join us up here on stage. So if your microphone and camera are working and you're in a place like an office or a library, wherever, where you can speak freely, click that and you can join us, and I'll beam you up on stage as soon as the time is right. It's really easy to do. In fact, it takes less time to do than it did for me to explain. That's the most powerful way, but those are the three ways that you can participate in the conversation here. If that's not enough, head over to Twitter and use the hashtag FTTE. And we find that sometimes people have a conversation there. People who are attending this video conference will sometimes tweet out notes or observations. Sometimes people who can't make it, say they're in a car and their broadband isn't fast enough to do this, will tweet us questions. So I'll be monitoring that as we go. Just use the hashtag FTTE. And thanks to Shindig for making this technology platform available. I'd also like to thank, lastly, but definitely not leastly, our supporters on Patreon. If you don't know Patreon, it's a crowdfunding site like GoFundMe or Kickstarter, and it's a way to collaboratively fund a creative project. In that case, it's the Future of Education Observatory. And people contribute as little as $1 a month to keep all the technology running and to keep all the lights on. I do want to thank some of the people who contribute more than that. Folks on this slide like Jeannie Kim Han and Corey S., Chris Lott, Bob Johnson, all kinds of wonderful people, Matthew P. Henry. We're really grateful to them for their support. If you're interested in joining them, just go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander. So that's who supports this. That's where it comes from. Now let me introduce this week's guest. I'm delighted to introduce Dorothy Kim. She's a professor of English at Brandeis University, and she specializes in a whole bunch of topics. She's a medievalist, so she specializes in that world. She also does a lot of work on digital humanities, and that intersection is why I wanted to have her as a guest. Dorothy has done fantastic work in introducing digital humanities to people, both to her students. She's done groundbreaking research in the field. And at the same time, she also studies and has run into the buzzsaw of online abuse and trolling. And she's thought deeply about this and practiced extensively on it. So that intersection between the digital humanities, trolling and abuse online, I'd like us to explore that and to think about what this means for the future of education as we know it. So please welcome Professor Dorothy Kim. Hello, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi, everyone.
Oh, perfect. I'm so glad you could make it. Thank you for making the time.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
Now, are you, I'm looking behind you, it looks like a forest.
So it's my office, and I basically have like a sloped hill with trees behind me, so that's why it looks like a forest. So the leaves disappear in the winter, and then it's a sloped hill, but with, lots of sunshine coming in. So it's a sort of interesting design thing.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, welcome from Brandeis. I often ask participants to introduce themselves, and the prompt I use is to ask, can you tell us what you're going to be working on for the next year, say for summer, spring? What are the big projects and the big ideas that are going to be occupying you?
So things that are happening in the next year. So at the moment, I'm actually finishing edits on another collection for the digital humanities called The Alternative Genealogies of the Digital Humanities that thinks about politics and the digital humanities and histories of various issues in the digital humanities. So we're thinking about histories of some of the contributors are thinking about histories of certain tools. The sort of origin myth of the digital humanities goes back to this Jesuit priest who was a medievalist. So that is what has interested me in doing this collection. But he was a fascist in Italy during Mussolini. And so there's a lot of things to unpack there. He also worked for DARPA, which is the big CIA R&D wing. And he got his tech from IBM, and from at least the article that several people wrote for the collection, that tech is based on a lot of the computer or computational technology that was used in the Holocaust by the Third Reich. So there's a lot of difficult histories to unpack. And so that's one of the things that I'm working on right now. I'm also working with the University of Minnesota Press right now to I've just submitted a book to them, Digital Whiteness and Medieval Studies, about the alt-medieval. So I'm working on the fascist, the alt-right, online, and medievalism and medieval studies. So that's been kind of interesting. So that's a project that requires a lot of chocolate and fortitude because it's just really difficult to look at really terrible things all the time.
I,
So
I can imagine, and I wish you the best. I hope our session here can help support you in that work.
yes, thanks. So those are some of the things I'm working on. I'm also working on my own NEH archive, the Archive of Early Middle English. I'm in the
Mhm.
process of moving it to Brandeis and sort of setting it up again. So I've been actually thinking a lot about platform development for archives and reading a lot about digital archives and the politics of digital archives and sort of questions I have about that. So those are the things, at least in digital studies, digital humanities, that I'm working on for the next year or so.
Wow, that's an awful lot. Are you going to be teaching over the next academic year as well?
Yes, I am. I'm teaching. I'm teaching in the fall. I just finished teaching a graduate um, digital humanities methods class. I just came off. I'm just back from 2 weeks at the University of Victoria at DHSI, where I taught for 1 week and basically did a bunch of meetings the second week and sort of popped into some classes as a guest lecturer and things like that. And so I've been teaching a lot in the last little bit in digital humanities. So at DHSI, I was teaching with my colleague Angel Nieves the class on race, social justice, and the digital humanities. So it's been pretty full. It's been a full calendar for DH. So in the fall, I'm teaching a literary mediascapes class, which is a sort of long book history / critical maker class. So I will
Hmm.
make my students scrape vellum and be really grossed out by biohazard. And
Yeah.
then I will make my students at the end work on Arduino and so
Neat.
Arduino kits. So yes, so sort of a long media critical maker class.
Yeah.
I'm teaching an Arthurian Lit class, and in the spring I'll be teaching an intro to DH for undergraduates, and then I'll be teaching a sort of global Middle Ages Chaucer class. So
Wow. Wow, that's fantastic. Just love the way that you get current politics, critical studies, classic medieval studies, all lined up and integrated. That's fantastic.
yeah, so it's a lot of fun.
Friends, I have a whole series of questions to ask.
Okay.
Don't let me take over the floor, rather. This forum is for you to share your questions. And as you can tell, we have a tremendous variety of projects and themes that Professor Kim is working on. So please don't hesitate. And as I say that, questions have popped up. And one of them has already just come up from wonderful Maha Bali at the American University of Colorado. And she wants to know, what is Arduino?
Oh,
Um,
Arduino. So basically, Arduino is the sort of I basically they're the sort of basic components for hardware computing, right? And also you can download some software or like actually create your own kind of custom software to make things happen, right? To sort of so Arduino, I actually what I do, you can they come in big kits that they are sent to you. It's usually the kind of thing that computer scientists or computer students can use to just kind of play around and create custom computing devices. But you can actually get kits that are workable for actually even kind of the younger high school and junior high set all the way into college. And the one I get is actually a Kukai set because it actually is linked up. I'm actually doing a sort of history of software. And so I talk about Ada Lovelace, I talk about the history of the Jacquard loom. So the history of software is the history of textile development and sort of fabric and all that. And the history of sewing. And so that sort of folds into actually the mediascape in the 19th century that the class will talk about, which is quilting. So the history of quilting and communication through this other kind of often uh, hands-on digital materiality. And then I do the Kukai kit because it's a sort of has all the parts you need to set up a very straightforward and simple Arduino task. So like blinking lights or, a couple of other things, nothing too complicated, but it also comes with fabric and a whole thing. So you can actually make like a button that, has blinking lights or some sort of like crafts project, basically. So it's a sort of form of doing critical making that loops back to a kind of history of software development as well as sort of basics for hardware. And so it's nice because I think often, the technical or the theoretical or even the history is very abstract. But when you sort of give them like this, and it's this kit with like a little puppet on it. So it's kind of interesting for them to carry around. You give them this kit. I mean, I also love the kit because all the little pieces are sorted nicely. There's like a little pillbox that keeps all your circuits in place and sort of organized. But I think the nice thing is it forces them to sort of think through this longer discussion of that history, right? This history about textile development, about fabric, about the history of various kinds of mediascapes, and then into, what is a digital, it's a critical digital making project, right? Except for they're sewing it with computer thread. And the nice thing about the smaller Kukai kit is that you don't need, I have the capabilities on campus to teach them how to solder. There is a soldering sort of location somewhere in the library somehow, but the smaller Arduino kit doesn't actually means you don't need to solder the computer thread and things like that to make the hookups and stuff like that. So it sort of is much more of a combination quilting and computing project at the same time. So it's kind of nice, and you can explain why you don't want to cross certain wires, and, what positive, negative charges do and things like that. So, some hardware and then some software basics. And then the kit comes with like a nice little booklet of a bunch of projects they can actually try. So, I want to make like a little puppet mitten, or I want to, with like blinking lights as eyes, or I want to do X or Y. So they have the materials. And I also like it because since it's the last task of the semester, it doesn't take as long, or it's not as involved, if that makes sense. Because in a way, you can take an Arduino kit and do this kind of work, this kind of fabrication, what is it, wearable tech work, but it could take 5 days, like 9 to 4, and you still wouldn't finish the project because it's a big craft project. So this is a little bit more manageable, bite-sized, I would say, but still sort of works through the various skills. And it's a good way also to talk about a kind of ongoing history also of like digital surveillance, because one of the really interesting things to think about with this Arduino is that a lot of wearable tech is about biometric surveillance, right? It's about you wearing your Fitbit, and then all this information is being used. You've agreed to be a research subject when you got the Fitbit, and all the information is being used or sold, right, to third parties as research. So they're basically taking your biometric information for research and other commercial purposes and things like that. So, and this can in various ways affect people about, they want to check and see how much you're exercising. This can affect, we've seen the articles that talk about like, well, this is ways for companies to monitor whether or not they want to fire you, because you might cause them a lot of health insurance costs or something like that. So it's an interesting thing to think about that. And also one of the last several years, Levi's has actually created a sort of jacket line or jeans line called Jacquard, which goes back to the history of software and goes back to the Jacquard loom. And it's basically computerized fabric that basically is, it's supposed to mean that you just touch your jacket and you're like, your headphones, your music can change, or you can do a bunch of things on your jacket, but it is a form of biometric surveillance. So now they can like basically scan a bunch of things on your body that they can, then use that information again. Your geospatial location, various like, how much you've been walking or bicycling or whatever it is, your choices, that sort of thing. So it's an interesting conversation for them to have, but also to sort of see how all that work is, what does this work mean, if that makes sense. I mean, one of the nice things is we get to talk about things like there are actually sort of anti surveillance fabrics on the market that you can buy where they can't scan past it. So there are sort of defensive surveillance, possibilities that are sort of DIY and like crafting possibilities. Like if you really don't want people to try to scan your body, you can actually do certain things. Same with facial recognition. This is sometimes we talk about that. This is work that Misha Cardenas and some other people have done several years ago. One of the ways to do it to stop facial recognition is interesting haircuts. You need something that covers one eye, so bangs apparently completely screw up the facial recognition. And then 80s geometric shaped bright colored makeup, so you sort of look like an 80s new wave pop star. That apparently the geometric shapes somehow disrupt or kind of short circuit the facial recognition technology.
And
So
I envy your students because as they work in this one project in this one class, you help scaffold their ability to think through all of this history, all this politics, all the overlapping technologies, literally in their hands. That's terrific.
And I think it's a good way for them to think about, I think a lot of the kind of crashing hot topics about technology and our politics now and surveillance and all the sort of things happening at the moment, right? So, I mean, what is it this week that the news says that now, in order to get a visa into the U.S., the government wants 5 years of your social media data. So that this is just kind of continuing to ratchet up. And I think I mean, one of the things is I have them read both Simone Brown's Dark Matters, which is a book about it's about race and surveillance. And she's working out of surveillance studies, American studies, sociology, American history, and she's thinking about a kind of longer history of racialized surveillance in relationship to Black bodies. And then I also have them have a look at, or we'll have them look at Sophia Noble's book, The Algorithms of Oppression, which, I mean, she's really clear in explaining that the next sort of civil rights moment, or the next civil rights area, if we're going to talk about future trends, is going to be in artificial intelligence. And that's going to be the sort of next terrain where the battle about people's human rights and civil rights are going to happen. And so I think it's something where they have to think through what is going on, and it gives them a sort of chance to also, look at the material, think about the actual what's going on making these things, but also, what are these histories, and what are then the kind of structures that have allowed some of these things to happen.
Uh, this is a terrific set of connections to make. On Twitter, a longtime friend of the program, George Station, says,
Hi, George.
Excellent chasm-straddling discussion so far. And we have a few questions. Let me just spotlight one of these, which is from David Skinner, who asks, I wonder if you know of the Wilcox collection of political ephemera at Kansas University.
No, I don't. What's in that? I'm very curious.
If you want to follow up with another text response, or if you can get your camera or mic working, you can join us on stage. But it looks like contemporary political ephemera, so that sounds actually pretty exciting. We also have another question here from Carl Hakkarainen, who asks, what is the biggest impediment that your students, peers, or tenure board face when trying to get started with digital humanities?
I think the answer to that is probably really different for each group, right? I think with the students, they're often there because they come to a class, right? And so it's part of an assignment. It's scaffolded within that. I actually fold in digital humanities stuff in all my classes. So the Arthurian class will do stuff as well as the Chaucer class. So it's not necessarily something that's separate. I mean, at the moment, I'm also at an institution that just passed a digital literacy requirement as a general ed requirement, and I think I'm all four of my classes fulfill that that requirement for them. Whichever, in other words, it's like you could take any of the four classes, whether it be Global Chaucer or Arthurian Lit, or actually the Literary Mediascapes class or the Intro to DH class, and you would fulfill this. So it would be up to them how they want to fulfill that. I think with the students, it's scaffolding, and for them, a lot of the times, it's it's a sort of way to frame out various discussions or areas of what does this mean and what are the ways to think through this, right? So I think for them, they're interested, or to explain the digital humanities to them is to explain a kind of methodology, but also to explain, I think, a history, and to explain also a way in which schoolwork for them, right? So schoolwork for them is not just necessarily a paper, that it becomes potentially these other kinds of things, that it's projects, often it's collaborative, that it can be these sort of critical theoretical maker projects, that it can be multimodal projects, that means that they have to take on not just thinking through text, but also sound, visuality, thinking through how to visualize things, or, other ways they might do stuff, right? That they might turn in something that's not an essay, but instead is like a twine game, is something I would be happy for them to turn in, right? So I think it would just depend, right? And I think with the peers, often I think peers are often curious in relationship to how it might help their research questions or the work they do, right? Or possibly it might help them in their classes pedagogically. And then there's a kind of question about, well, how would you learn to do this, or what are the resources, or is this really complicated? Or I think if it's about classwork, if it's about a pedagogical discussion, often that's more straightforward to discuss. Then you can sort of say, oh, you can have your students turn in kind of a multimodal essay. That means they have to learn how to rhetorically organize an argument, not just with text, but also with sound and images, maybe even video, right? And often I think libraries are really helpful in the way that they will have support for that, and support for the students to learn different ways to do that. And then I think for the tenure boards, it really depends. I think this is a conversation that a lot of universities are having, trying to figure out how this works, right? And I think it really depends on what the institutional frameouts are. I think if some institutions, I'm always amazed in some ways that if I tell my colleagues, or I tell people at different institutions what I do, if I talk to the science or STEM side and I explain, oh, I work on this collaborative, government funded archive project doing digital archive, and I've gotten an NIH grant, et cetera, they understand, right? They're like, oh, you wrote like a grant proposal, you have like a timeline, you have these like outcomes set up, you have like the schedule, you are probably trying to get money for graduate students and also maybe undergraduate research assistants, you work out of like a lab setting. So there's like a kind of legibility that they get, or they can translate. And then I think what happens, I think, in the humanities, the social sciences are interesting because they kind of straddle both sides. The humanities is more sort of trying to explain that you're working on the STEM model more, if that makes sense, but you're actually trying to be very critical about it, or think about it in relationship to the context of questions that are happening in the humanities. So questions about histories and about power, about the differentials in power, about the question of, can you change structures in order for there to be a priority in relationship to ethics and social justice, right? So things like that, right? These become, actually, I think some of these questions are legible in the social sciences. I think some of the ways the structures of digital work is legible to STEM, and I think sometimes it's sometimes hard to explain to humanities people that you're actually working in this way that is legible to different disciplines or different areas of campus, but in fact it's still a kind of humanities driven question, or a humanities different driven methodology, about things that are related to power differentials, about the critical, about even actually, thinking about expressions of scholarship that are more artistic or more creative, that are a part of the kind of humanities discussion. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think I've always been interested in doing digital work because of the possibilities of kind of opening up different modal possibilities about experimentation, about thinking through, is there another way other than the sort of print essay, right? Or the print book to have conversations, to talk to people, to sort of have intellectual exchange, and to, do it together. And yet it's also a field that has really deep and difficult histories that are related to funding and development of various digital tools and structures that are enmeshed in a kind of histories related to military industrial complex and government surveillance and violence. So there's a lot.
There is, and there's a lot in that rich answer. Thank you very much. Carl, I think you have a full strategy to go on right now for implementing digital humanities. We have friends. I would say please bring in more questions and comments, but you're clearly throwing them out like mad. And let me bring up, we have a video guest. Let me bring in excellent Stephen Downs, who was our guest last week, in fact.
Hi, Stephen.
Welcome. Give a second for the panelists to line up.
Just waiting for everything to line up. Are we lined up?
Yes.
You are lined up. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Nice comments. So I've got a question. This goes back to the thing about surveillance, but it also ties into some of your more recent remarks about power and power structures. And the question that I submitted to Brian was essentially, is whether the problem is with the surveillance itself, or is it with what is done with the data that is gathered by the surveillance? So as a mental model to think about this, imagine the data is gathered, but nothing at all is ever done with it. Is this still a problem?
I think it really depends on a whole host of questions and things. I think about the model of, say, the guerrilla archivists, the sort of radical archivists happening in the library science community, where they will collect and archive histories for communities that are often endangered, but won't actually release any of that. I mean, literally, we're imagining them burying stuff and not actually like unburying it for like 50 years or more. And, there is a model, but it is a very specific set of groups with and professionals with a very certain ethical and theoretical praxis that they're working on, if that makes sense. I think the thing is, we have to think about, well, what do the communities want, right? And I think there's this question of not just consent, but a discussion particularly happening in Indigenous communities about sovereignty. So, they don't want you to collect their data, and they're not interested because their ongoing history for centuries have been about that data being used for various, terrible, violent things from the government, from the academic industrial complex. They have all these histories. So they are a group, for example, that would be like, no, don't ever collect the data. It is not your data. It is our community's sovereignty, decisions, etc. We are not interested. If they are interested, it would be something that they would work with, or they would keep within community and things like that. So I think it's really, I think this is stuff that a lot of social science research runs into, especially in relationship to sort of issues of like health and human services, or, other kinds of studies. I think sometimes it's okay not to collect some data, because often that data might be used in ways that you that could potentially be really violent to various groups. And so I think maybe the question I have is more, one of the things I do when I do my graduate class is I actually make them write an ethics frame out. So they have to actually talk about their data and where's the data coming from, depending on the project, and like what their actual practices will be from whatever best practices they can pull. But they have to think about the question of, well, whose data is this? What community are you working with? And have you had an ongoing conversation with them that is about sort of thinking about some of the tenets that are happening in Indigenous studies, the question of respect and reciprocity and sovereignty. And then, I actually, for that unit, brought in the IRB people on campus. So they explained the IRB process, which is sort of fascinating, but also really mind-boggling, especially since apparently IRB changed in January after not having changed for 40 years, particularly apparently with an eye to thinking about digital issues. So for instance, digital storytelling is not actually required for IRB anymore, which I didn't realize until they came. So that was like the new thing that's happening. But I think it's a sort of thing where they need to actually get all the research and discussions going and think through before they make the decisions about collecting the data and why they should collect the data. I think sometimes that, and even with that, I mean, I deal in my sort of larger, more traditional project, I deal with a data set of things that are, about people and written by people or involve people that have been dead for a really, really long time. So hundreds and hundreds of years, where it would be really hard for me, more or less, to like try to find, I don't know, the sort of descendants of people from the 11th to 13th century. But at the same time, my recent issue, or something that I've been thinking about, and I just gave a talk about it in the spring, is one of the things is, as my field is starting to do more thinking about the question of race in the pre-modern past. One of the things that has sort of intersected, and it's this work I do in medieval studies, is that there's an ongoing discussion in African American studies, especially with archives related to transatlantic slavery, about the markup and also the data collection, or the sort of practices of statistical history and data collection in relationship to the transatlantic slave trade. There's a theoretical and ethical issue where basically you've made these bodies that have already been imagined as sort of objects into objects again by collecting their data in order to, create these databases. They're back to being data points again, right? And this is something that also I would say the communities around Jewish studies around the Holocaust have also talked about this problem. So this kind of data, this ethical data question, right? And so and I've been thinking about, well, now that I have this archive, it seems like it wouldn't be controversial or have, these things. But in fact, more and more we're getting histories, or we're getting like archaeological information that shows that we're actually, African enslaved men and women in my part of England during that period. So when my archive, which is usually just literary, talks about Black men and women and Black Ethiopians, it is connected to real bodies on the ground that are often enslaved. And so I'm having a kind of think through about like, well, what are the ethical implications of marking up this kind of data? Because like, what does this mean? And what are the best practices, or is there a different practice to not make them, again, these kind of data points, right? Which is actually kind of theoretical issues coming out of really great discussion by a lot of really wonderful Black feminist scholars in history and African American studies. So this is the work of Sadia Hartman and Jessica Marie Johnson, and to think about that. So I think there is a way in which it's not even, whatever the data is, it's not even necessarily should we collect data now? It is also about the question of data and how to work with it in the past and in the contemporary now, and what are the best ways to make sure we don't kind of recapitulate that problem of making often these these men and women who were the victims of really terrible violence and atrocities into, again, dehumanizing them into data points. So there's like, so there's actually a lot of really interesting discussion in archive studies and library science, in digital humanities, and in areas like African American studies and Jewish studies that have been thinking about these issues. And so I think if it's like collecting data now, it is about, well, what communities are we talking about? What kind of data are we talking about? What are the potential? You almost have to think. You have to think about the future, right? And I think, especially now, because the world is kind of on fire and the politics are kind of on fire, and you just don't know where the data is going to be used in ways that might be weaponized. You have to actually think through this question. And so I find the model of the radical archivist, the guerrilla archivist, really interesting, because they are sort of admitting that there are archives or stories or data or information that should not be released to the public, that they want to collect it for preservation purposes, but they don't want, they need to literally hide it. They're going to bury it in the ground, or do these things where maybe it'll be released decades and decades later, but it's this kind of question of safety, right? I think similarly, like I have colleagues who work on sort of Latin American studies, who work on very complex 20th century archives related to a lot of political violence. Often the administrative data has it's like the richest trove of like consistent information. But what will that do with the families, right? And will they put them in harm's way again? So
when do we make these dark archives?
Most of what you talked about there was uses of the data and potential uses of the data. The key thing that you said, at least that I drew from this, was that the collection of the data, the very fact of collecting the data, might have an impact beyond the way it's used. By changing the way that people are regarded, as you said, as data points as opposed to something else. But I think that there would be pushback on that to some degree. You can't make data exist and then not exist. If a person was transported from a place to another place at a certain time, that is a piece of data. You can't make it not a piece of data anymore. And so there's an independence of data such that you can't say that data is owned by any particular community or group. And indeed, I think it would be very controversial to say that data is owned in that way. But those are just my thoughts on this.
I think one of the other angles to think about is that in computational linguistics, right, the linguists would tell you, and they're one of the early kind of adopters and workers on large corpora scale data. Data is always curated. Data is always a kind of choice and methodological point of view, right? So in that way, it's never independent. One of the main, and I think best critiques of things like surface reading and other things is that it needs to attend to the particularities of the data, right? And this is actually what computational linguistics has done really, really methodologically well. And so I don't think it's ever this kind of independent, free-floating, separate entity. It always involves people and people making choices and people making political choices, or choices related to their particular scholarly and other praxis. So data collection is never a kind of neutral thing. It's always the data itself is always curated. It's always curated. The standards are always set. What gets collected and how. The structures of that are always very specific. And I think maybe in the social sciences that's talked about more readily, right? I think the sciences also discuss this because they're constantly arguing about whether or not the baseline of the data collection or the modeling of it is even worth what the results say, right? So I think this is something where maybe in the humanities, we need to attend more to these questions. And I think I think, I think the Indigenous Studies community would disagree with you. I think a lot of communities would disagree with you about whether, the data is free and things like that and independent. I think they would be like, no. It's sort of like, asking them to say, yes, take our cultural artifacts because they're really old, but it's still their cultural artifacts. It's their choice it should be in their hands to make the choice about their histories and then the sort of well-being of their communities and what that means.
I'd like to, first of all, thank you both, because that was a fantastic exchange. And Stephen, we'll have a video of yours up ASAP. But we have a whole stack of people who have questions. I'll make sure everyone else gets a chance.
Okay.
Thank you again, Stephen. This is a rich topic. You've really just given us an awful lot to go on. Let me connect one person's question. This is a person who can't ask this in person, but they want to forward this to me. This is Professor Ed Webb at Dickinson College, who wants to come back to your point about white supremacy and digital technology. He asks, quote,
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to know if you think medievalists pushing back against white nationalists on Twitter and on other platforms has had any effects outside the community of medievalists.
I think it can, because one of the things when I was working on the alt medieval book is one of the arguments I was making is that, in fact, academics have come very lately to this, what I think of as a kind of war, right? For the sort of, for a kind of war, a digital war. So on the ground, the public was already having this kind of clash or this war. And on one side, it was white supremacists. And on the other side, it was actually Black, Indigenous, people of color, various minority communities who were actually using digital spaces to push back on the white supremacists. So sites like Medieval POC, who has a Tumblr blog, who sort of, and also tweets all the sort of images of Black, Indigenous, people of color in the pre-modern past as a sort of art historical praxis. Sort of other things like that, the sort of I need diverse games people, the people who have been sort of pushing back on, I need diverse books, these conversations happening there. So I think this is something where actually the vocality of medievalists online pushing back helps depending on what you're doing, all right, because not all medievalists are pushing back, will help one or the other, right? The thing is that academic medievalists, I think, have an ethical obligation to actually write or, package their material or the things they know or the things they have access to, because this is our research topic, in ways that are easy and straightforward for the public to get a hold of, in order to, say, hey, so-and-so, this linked article clearly shows that there were, if you read on bioarchaeology, that there were, people buried in Viking England who were sub-Saharan African. So this idea of a pre-modern Viking white past is BS, that sort of thing. So I actually do think that there is something to be said, because I think the other thing that people maybe don't understand, and this is the bit where my interesting intersection of interests and research topics have sort of helped me understand more quickly, is that the alt-right is a digital phenomenon. And basically this means that they use media and social media really skillfully. So it's not just Twitter, it's also Instagram, it is Facebook, it is Snapchat, it is YouTube. They use these platforms. It is Twitch. They use these platforms really skillfully to get their message across. And if there is no pushback, then their message basically takes up space in that vacuum. So that becomes the message. And so I think the thing is, the alt-right or the far right is a digital phenomenon. And if we don't actually do this and resist it in those spaces, then we're basically not talking or not actually helping.
That's a really, really good answer. Thank you, Ed, for the great question. Springing off of that, we had a question, a follow-up question from Mahabali, and let me just put this up on the screen. The connection. She wants to know more about your digital literacy requirement model that she's working with, And the connection, I just want to flesh out a little bit of a connection, is you're talking about teaching medievalists or encouraging medievalists to be able to fight against the alt-right and digital platforms. And I wonder if you could just add to this, teaching students to be able to have that power.
So I actually, in all my classes now, I'm pretty open about the fact that I sort of feel like it's like I don't know, like, just get it out of the way that I am a target of certain far right figures. And so this means that we're going to go and spend the first day, at least part of the first day, after we go through the syllabus, on how to walk through how to lock down their accounts and basic forms of digital security. So this is when I use the FemTechNet Center for Solutions for Online Violence, that entire menu for Survivor. They have really great things also for Educator, which is great, especially in terms of thinking about teaching with social media and the ethics of that and the various kind of power issues related to that. So there's really great stuff there. They also have a bunch of video things for people to look at. But I go through and ask my students, do this as a sort of form of like first off homework, go through your digital profile and figure out, like, can people find you? How much information do you have out there? Do you know this? Right? And, walk through and see if you can do a cleanup of things you don't want people to know that about you. And I say this mostly as a way to say, it's not just obviously I'm an extreme case of sort of the far right coming for me, but employers or just other people like coming for your, trying to find information, that you should be really aware of what is out there under your name, right? And then the other thing we walk through is the web literacy. So that really lovely and really well done book that is available for free that walks them through how to read articles online and understand whether they should, like, the sort of litmus test of, is this valid information or not? So it's an informational literacy sort of discussion. And I think that book does a good job just walking through with students, like, do you know where the source of this is? Can you like read across or read up and down? Like, can you find the genealogy of where this information came from? Is this information, if you read around, is it sort of seems to actually be accurate or not? So it gives them sort of more steps before they just decide, oh, this must be true, even though I found it on this weird site. That sort of thing.
Field book, right?
Yes, the web literacy book. So the digital literacy requirement at Brandeis was something that was voted in before I showed up. I was voted in at the last faculty meeting, and then I showed up and they were like, oh, we are now supposed to plan for a digital literacy requirement. That's gen ed requirement for the entire campus. There was a lot of discussion, and I think it was left finally up to, there was a range of, from what I understand, because I wasn't involved in any of these meetings or in fact any of the faculty discussion, but from what I've heard, there was a range of discussions about how this would be fulfilled. On one side, the computer science department decided that humanities students should take Intro to Python, and this is how they would fulfill the digital literacy requirement. This immediately made a bunch of social science and humanities faculty kind of go, no, and I can understand that. And then so instead, it was basically, after much discussion, it was really left up to each department to decide how these things were fulfilled, with a minimum of at least 2 assignments or 2 kind of units that would address this in various ways. So there are ranges. So my department decided there's a kind of flexibility of what you can do, and there's sort of a range of possibilities of how you can do it. I think other departments, I think classics actually have a scaffolded thing, like year 1, you do this kind of stuff, year 2, you do this kind of stuff. So it actually kind of graduates to more advanced digital literacy and digital skills building, right? So they actually folded it in directly to their major and things like that. So so it became, and that, classics includes not just literature and language, it also includes history and archaeology. So there's a whole, it's an interdisciplinary major and department. So there was a whole, they're thinking about digital scanning and, sort of other things happening in their fields and things like that. So it has been a specific depending on the department. And then there was I think at one point there was an idea of floating potentially a kind of maybe like certain people can teach certain classes for a bunch of departments. And I think they're sort of still working it out, but it starts this year. So the beginning of it is this fall. So classes, so we'll see what the first year looks like. But yes, all 4 of my classes have been approved for this.
They do sound like Dorothy Kim classes. I mean, this is, if you, by the way, that was Mahabali from the University of Cairo, who also researches and teaches digital literacy, so we can follow up with her.
And it's in Discussing DH, so if you guys, which is free now, so you could download it for free. Yay.
So I'm conscious of time, and we've had a few questions that haven't come up, that haven't been able to float yet. I want to bring them together, if I could, for a final question.
Okay.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned the world being on fire. And
yes.
you talked about a large number of stresses. And different questioners have evoked different stresses as well. Tom Riley, another longtime friend of the program, wanted to ask how climate change fits into this. So what I was wondering, if possible, if you could just think about all these different stresses, how does higher education respond? And how do you see us responding over the next 5 years or so? Do you think we'll turn away and ignore this all, or do you think we'll have to engage as you've been engaging so well and so thoroughly?
I think in terms of the climate change, they're all interlinked, right, in these ways. The politics in relationship to social justice, in relationship to race and gender, in relationship to all these sorts of histories, right, really kind of interlink. I think one of the reasons why I gave you guys the link to that Anatomy of AI article, which is really great. It's really interesting in terms of surveillance and a longer durée history of surveillance and media archaeology. It's about actually, it's not Alexa, it's one of the other kind of, it's about the Amazon Echo, right? But, in discussions of colleges and campuses, all of a sudden deciding they want to put an Alexa in every student's room, but also what that means in terms of surveillance and privacy, but also how these devices are made. And the nice thing about that article, it does this sort of deep, almost archaeological layering dive. It starts out by talking about where the rare earths come from and the fact that they're literally like chopping off mountains in order to get this, and how it's devastating the economies of those locations in order to get the tech, in order to get the rare earth materials to make the Amazon Echo. We know this in relationship to the cell phone, the tablets, the computers that we're dealing with. We know this in terms of the copper that is needed for certain kind of structural wiring. We've seen this in the 19th century. I mean, I think that article does a good job talking about how 19th century colonialists stripped parts of Southeast Asia in order to get the rubber, right, to make industrial products. So this is not a sort of recent environmental history. It's just accelerated. I think the whole idea of not being able to reuse or repair, the whole conversation about repairing our tech, the fact that we're making large swaths of the global south into toxic dumping sites for our technology, and that's sort of seeping into the ecosystem and what it's doing to people's health there, doing to the actual environment. These are all kind of interconnected questions. And I think in terms of this, what does this mean for higher ed? I think it's we're since everything is kind of on fire and sort of feels like it's accelerated, I think we're at a point where it's not as if any of this can be hidden anymore, right? That these things are all coming to a head. And I think I'm hoping that what happens is a kind of push and organization on college campuses. I think it's going to be spearheaded by students, because I think the students have really realized that we're on fire. There's a reason why it is Greta Thunberg in Sweden basically protesting in this sort of global way about climate change, because she's like, you are leaving us basically with a house on fire. And, and I think it's the students who are going to be pushing this kind of organized change agenda because they see clearly the house basically burning to ashes in front of them. I think that in terms of technology and digital and higher ed, I think it's also going to be this conversation that happens with the students in the forefront, but also a conversation that where I think what I hope is that the digital studies, digital humanities really starts to turn to become a kind of activist unit, that we are the unit that can actually synthesize and explain and contextualize things like, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have these AI things in your dorm room and why that's a really big problem, why these histories are a problem, why in fact, that this is going to create major civil rights issues, that these, yes, STEM on one side, STEM is sort of frantically trying to develop artificial intelligence. But we need to be the unit to sort of say, like, these things are going to come with these huge problems, and you need to address this. And we are equipped to not only walk through our students through a kind of understanding of the histories of these technologies. Where do they come from? What are these sort of problems? But also the kind of infrastructure and why, a new logo or just sort of saying, oh my God, we fixed it, it's not going to be racist anymore. It's a patch, right? It's not actually understanding that the entire structure has systematically been developed to do this. So a patch is not necessarily, a Band-Aid is not going to help, right? A Band-Aid is not necessarily going to be the thing to stop whatever digital structure, digital tool, digital device, computational system from becoming something that we all hope it shouldn't become, that sort of thing. So I think, this is something that is then a whole kind of interconnected environmental thing. It's not, it is about race, gender, sexuality. It's about disability. It also is about the environment. It's also about power in all these different ways. And hopefully, the hope is that in the future that, we will start to organize together and push back. I would say the last thing is that I went to a really great conference in Vancouver called Digital Democracies, where Safiya Noble was talking, and people were asking her the question about this new interest in ethics, particularly ethics in AI. And she says, ethics, or the sort of like invocation of ethics, is actually kind of a problem. It's sort of like the whole well-being issue, like it's some sort of individual thing that you do yourself, and that it's about like your self-care as opposed to like systematic healthcare or like well-being for the country. And that actually more interesting is to think about digital studies and politics and sort of the critique of it as basically what happened with big tobacco in relationship to the tech industry, like that when the scientists and the people on the ground, the organizers all got together as a way to push back against big tobacco as a political organizing unit to say, no, in fact, you are like basically killing us and things like that, that we have to start thinking about systematic organizing in relationship to big tech, right? In our institutions on the ground as a kind of ongoing, actually long project, like the resistance and political organizing to big tobacco. That it's not about individual ethics, right? That it is about this whole thing. That the problem is, it's like massive and even bigger than big tobacco.
Professor Kim, I hate to pause now because this is so rich and it brings up so many other questions, but we just shot past the end of the hour and we have to pause.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for an rich and passionate answer to my way too big question.
Oh, that's totally fine.
And thank you for all of your answers to everybody's questions. Let me just quickly ask, the best way for everyone to keep up with you as you teach and research in these groundbreaking ways is through Twitter?
Yes. It's the open one, since it's hard to find me otherwise.
Understood. So we need to keep everyone follow at Dorothy K68, I think.
It's 98.
98. And follow Dorothy K98 on Twitter, and you can keep up with this. thank you so much for coming. I'm just in awe of your thought and your work, and I'm delighted that you've had time to join us. We'll follow up, and I think next year we want to bring you back so you can talk about your new book as it's come out.
Okay, thanks. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone. I hope you have a good day.
And stick around, everybody, because we have to introduce what's happening over the next week. So thank you again, by the way, for all these terrific questions. So next week, we'll follow up with the awesome Robin DeRosa. She's a professor, a great innovator and organizer of open education at Plymouth State University, and she'll be talking about open education and open research, as well as open teaching. She's a wonderful, wonderful person, a hero of mine, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. Meanwhile, we have finished The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, a book which haunted, I think, much of our conversation that we just had. If you haven't had a chance to read through it, the entire conversation is archived online, so you can follow that. It's a very, very powerful book. If you want to start thinking about our next book, please let me know. If you want to grab a copy of that, head to our online bookstore, the only bookstore in the future of education. And if you want to keep all of our conversations going, if you want to think about Indigenous people and data, if you want to think about privacy, about movements, if you want to think of STEM versus the humanities, we have lots of venues for these kinds of conversations. You can find our groups on Slack, on LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can find me, as well as Professor Kim and many other people on Twitter. My thanks for all of your participation. We'll see you online, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.